Just about everybody knows about the concept of overtime pay at their jobs, but many people who live in Ontario are unaware of the details, exceptions, nuances, and calculations that go into this topic. Both employees and employers might wonder when and how overtime is to be applied to a specific situation. Let's talk about what Ontario's Employment Standards Act has to say about this. However, before we dive in, remember, the ESA doesn't apply to every type of job. Be sure to watch our detailed video explaining which jobs fall outside its protections. My name is Ryan Keeney, and I'm a lawyer in Ontario. Let's get into it. Overtime pay is addressed at Section 22 of the Employment Standards Act, which is contained within Part 8 of this legislation. Rather than quote the exact wording of the legislation, which can be confusing, I'm simply going to explain what it means in plain English. Section 22 indicates that, normally, if you work more than 44 hours in a week for your employer in Ontario, your employer must pay you extra money called overtime pay. This extra pay is at least 1.5 times your regular hourly wage. For example, if you usually make $20 per hour, you should get $30 per hour for each hour worked beyond 44 hours in a week. However, it's important to note an exception to this rule. Managers and supervisors do not qualify for overtime if the work they do is managerial or supervisory. Even if they perform other kinds of tasks that are not managerial or supervisory, they are not entitled to get overtime pay if these tasks are performed only on an irregular or exceptional basis. This section goes on to indicate that if you have multiple jobs or roles with the same employer in a week, and these roles have different hourly rates, there are some specific rules. First, like I mentioned a moment ago, if the total hours you work for the same employer in a week add up to more than 44 hours, then you should receive overtime pay for the extra hours. And second, the overtime pay for these extra hours is calculated at 1.5 times the regular rate that applies to the specific job you are doing during those extra hours. So, if you have one job that pays $20 per hour and another that pays $25 per hour, then the overtime pay will depend on which job you are doing during the extra hours. While we're on the topic of employees who do more than one kind of work for the same employer, some employees might perform work that is specifically exempt from overtime pay, while other parts might be covered. In these situations, if at least 50% of the hours the employee works is in a job category that is covered, then the employee qualifies for overtime pay. Some employees might wonder how their overtime would be calculated if they are paid on a fixed salary. If an employee's hours of work change from day to day but their weekly pay stays the same, the employee is paid a fixed salary. A fixed salary compensates an employee for all non-overtime hours up to and including 44 hours a week. After 44 hours, the employee is entitled to overtime pay. Let's use an example to understand this point. Emma is paid on a fixed salary of $800 per week. She worked 48 hours this work week. First, Emma's regular non-overtime hourly rate of pay is calculated as follows. $800 divided by 44 equals $18.18. Emma was paid a regular rate of $18.18 for each hour she worked up to and including 44 hours. Next, her overtime rate is calculated. $18.18 times 1.5 equals $27.27. Therefore, her overtime rate is $27.27. Then, the amount of overtime she worked is calculated. 48 hours minus 44 hours equals 4 hours of overtime. Then her overtime pay is calculated. 4 hours times $27.27 per hour equal $109.08. Emma is therefore entitled to $109.08 in overtime pay. Finally, Emma's regular salary and overtime pay are added together. Her regular salary of $800 is added to $109.08. This gives us a total of $909.08. Moving on, the ESA also addresses the topic of averaging an employee's hours of work over multiple weeks to determine their entitlement to overtime pay. Instead of looking at a single week, an employer and employee can agree to calculate an employee's hours of work over a longer period, like 2 or more consecutive weeks. However, there are 2 requirements which must both be met. First, the employee and employer must have a mutual agreement that the employee's hours can be averaged over a specified number of weeks. This agreement should be in writing or otherwise clearly documented. And second, the period over which hours are averaged cannot be longer than 4 weeks. It can be shorter if the employee and employer have agreed to a specific number of weeks in their agreement. So if they agreed to average hours over 2 weeks, that's the limit. Let's use an example to understand this point better. Natalie and her employer agree in writing to average her hours for overtime purposes over a period of 2 weeks. Natalie works 60 hours the first week and 30 hours the second week. She earns $20 per hour and her overtime rate is $30 per hour. Natalie's overtime entitlement is calculated as follows. The total number of hours worked in the averaging period are added together and then divided by the number of weeks in the averaging period to get the average number of hours worked in each week of the averaging period. 60 hours plus 30 hours equals 90 hours. 90 hours divided by 2 weeks equals 45 hours per week. The average number of hours worked per week minus 44 hours equals the average number of overtime hours in each week of the averaging period. 45 hours per week minus 44 hours per week equals 1 overtime hour per week. The overtime entitlement in week 1 and 2 of the averaging period is calculated by multiplying the average overtime hours per week by her overtime rate for that week. In week 1, it's 1 hour times $30 per hour, which is of course $30. In week 2, it's the same. Therefore, the result is that Natalie is entitled to $60 of overtime pay in addition to her regular earnings. This provision allows flexibility in calculating overtime pay by looking at a longer time frame, but it must be based on a clear agreement between the employee and employer, and it cannot extend beyond the specified limit, which is 4 weeks unless agreed otherwise. Now, let's continue our lesson on this topic by turning our attention to some more requirements for averaging agreements. An averaging agreement must include specific dates, a start date, and an expiry date. These dates are essential to determine when the agreement begins and when it ends. Without these dates, the agreement is not considered valid. If an employee is not part of a trade union, which is a labor union that represents workers, then the agreement for averaging hours cannot have an expiry date more than 2 years after the start date. In other words, it cannot be a long-term agreement. This rule is in place to protect non-unionized employees from being locked into such agreements for extended periods. If an employee is part of a trade union and there's a collective agreement that applies to them, the averaging agreement must not last beyond the day when a subsequent collective agreement, which also applies to the employee, comes into effect. This ensures that any changes or new agreements negotiated by the union are incorporated into the averaging agreement when a new collective agreement is established. It's also important to keep in mind that instead of receiving extra money for working overtime, an employee can get paid time off work as compensation. For every hour of overtime worked, they receive 1.5 hours of paid time off, but 2 conditions have to be met. First, both the employee and the employer must agree to this arrangement. And second, the paid time off work must be taken within 3 months after the work week in which the overtime was earned. Or if the employee agrees, it can be taken within 12 months of that work week. If the employee's job ends before they have used up the paid time off they earned for overtime hours, the employer must pay the employee the equivalent overtime pay for those unused hours. This ensures that the employee receives the overtime compensation they are entitled to, even if their job ends. It's also important for both employers and employees to understand things that are just not legal. Employers and employees cannot enter into an agreement where the employee forfeits their entitlement to overtime pay under the ESA. Such agreements are prohibited and considered invalid. Nevertheless, an employee has the option to enter into an agreement to receive paid time off in lieu of overtime pay or to average their work hours for the purpose of calculating overtime pay. Furthermore, employers are not permitted to reduce an employee's regular wage to avoid paying 1.5 times their regular rate after working more than 44 hours or any other applicable overtime threshold in a work week. For instance, if John's regular pay rate is $25 per hour, his employer cannot decrease his regular rate to $20 per hour during a week when he works overtime and then compensate him at $30 per hour for the overtime hours worked instead of the correct rate of $37.50 per hour. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to hit those like and follow buttons. I'm Ryan Keeney, and I'll see you next time.